What I want today to do is to give a fairly academic presentation about two sort of seemingly contradictory threads in the way that Lewis thought about the way that we read and write and talk about literature. And so I actually like the tension that these create. So I'm going to set it up in context with his life and then walk through some of the implications in what we call the field of the study of literature and theology. Now, I want us to go to the autumn of 1954, and by 1954, Lewis had created this sort of result of literature. It's actually not a bad result, all in his Christian career. So these are the books that produced in his time up to this point in the autumn of 1954. It's not a bad turnout, a little better than I have done actually in the equivalent amount of time. Now, looking at specifically at the autumn of 1954, after a couple of decades of writing, he finally had completed in about 1952, published in 1954, his English Literature in the 16th Century. This is his literary magnum opus. This is his work as a literary historian brought to its highest level. In that same year that he completed that book, he released Mere Christianity, which brings together his BBC talks of the World War II era and really kind of raises his profile as a Christian speaker, which with the Screwtape Letters had given him local and some global fame. He had also begun publishing the Narnian Chronicles. 5 of the Narnian Chronicles were published by the fall of 1954 and had really not hit hugely, but began to put him on the map as a writer of these fairy tales, so these fantasy stories. And in about the same time, he had finished sometime in 1954 his memoir, Surprised by Joy, which is really a philosophical memoir, a particular reflection on a theme. And in the spring of 1955, he's going to write Till We Have Faces, which is his highest literary achievement in fiction. Excuse me. And so at this period, what we see is this real kind of critical shaping, this critical period all happening at this one point in the fall of 1954, when at the same time he was being inducted into a chair at Cambridge that was specifically designed for him in medieval and Renaissance literature. And so to launch that chair, he gave a speech, De Descriptione Temporum, which I would roughly translate as the season of the sense of the season, or something like that, a description of the times, quite literally. And he gives this speech actually on his birthday in 1954, his 56th birthday, and he really pivots his public profile. If you think of all these things that are in the minds of various students and listeners, and this speech is published on the BBC, and so if you think about the various people listening in, they each have a different kind of feeling about what he's going to offer the world. In Cambridge, though, he's supposed to speak as a scholar. He's supposed to speak as an expert, and yet what he does is he creates a whole different kind of persona for himself. He doesn't deal with kind of the literary school that he's joining. He doesn't do a kids these days concern about literature. Instead, what he talks about is the divide between the medieval and Renaissance world and today's reader, and presents himself not simply as another expert in the period, but actually as not just a guide, but actually a specimen of the culture that he's speaking of. I belong far more to that old medieval and Renaissance world, Lewis argues, than to yours. You don't want to be lectured on Neanderthal man by a Neanderthaler, but still less on dinosaurs by a dinosaur. But then he goes on to say, what would we want? Well, if a dinosaur dragged its slow length into the laboratory, would we all not look back as we fled? What a chance to know at last how it really moved and looked and smelled and what noises it made. And if the Neanderthaler could talk, even though his lecturing technique may leave much to be desired, should we not almost certainly learn from him something about which the best modern anthropologists could never have told us? He would tell us without even knowing he would tell us. It's an intriguing shift that takes place here in his public profile from scholar to the specimen of scholarship as he puts himself in the place of the medieval and Renaissance world and worldview. Now, he actually goes on to talk about the ancient Athenian. Even an untrained Athenian, he would want to hear him talk about Greek tragedy because he would know in his bones so much more than we seek in vain. At any moment, some chance phrase might, unknown to him, show us where modern scholarship had been on the wrong track for years. And so what's intriguing about Lewis's particular position, considering the class dynamics of the Oxbridge worlds at the time, is that he puts himself as the Athenian in this particular story, not as the Greek scholar looking at the Athenian. Right? And he actually argues that you need to give up the things you know as a modern reader in order to read literature from another place and time. Okay. While Lewis may fail as a critic, as a literary historian, he may be useful to the students as someone to look to as a specimen of that particular culture. Now, Lewis will be completely unaware of a revolution in the field of anthropology that, even at this time, is moving in the same direction, trying to close the gap between distant objectivist study and an appreciation of the interior experience of the community being studied. And this seems to be what Lewis is doing here, trying to get people to look inside. Now, Lewis is never bothered by the fact that he doesn't know what field is coming. He resists these kind of movements. And yet what's really intriguing is how he keeps kind of predicting these particular movements. He wants to create the same kind of shift that we see in the field of anthropology, the field that moves to looking at the inside of the experience. This autobiographical turn at the height of Lewis's academic career, when all ears are listening on the BBC and in Cambridge, when he presents himself as the dinosaur or the Athenian rather than, the anthropologist, he presents himself not as like a neuropsychologist looking at a lover in love, but as a lover in love, describing his experience. This critical shift is actually super interesting and something that's worth looking at. And I'm going to use the word autoethnography because even though it wasn't a method that had been quite refined, it was really part of the field of anthropology at this point. I want to draw out a couple of threads from the world of autoethnography and talk about that. Now, in the field of literature and theology, I'm kind of attracted to Heather Walton and the University of Glasgow School and their approach. She talks about, in this text, literature, theology, and feminism, interrogating both texts and cultures in order to generate new theological insight. That is her goal in this particular study. And I think there's really transformational possibilities within her approach and within this whole school. And so I want to look at her particular book, Writing Methods in Theological Reflection, a very approachable and effective guide to this particular topic. She talks about exploring autoethnography. Autoethnography is a way of using personal experience to investigate an issue or concern that has wider cultural or religious significance. The experience here acts as a lens that allows us to see, this is interesting language, to see and to interrogate aspects of the concerning question that might be missed in a more abstract discussion. It comes from social sciences, it comes from anthropology in particular, and it's effective in reflective theological writing because it allows us to look with fresh eyes at familiar beliefs and practices. Okay, and so this looking at the self, this turning on to personal experience and using that as part of the data is absolutely critical to really the way that theological reflection, the way that literature study has been done by so many, and I'm going to argue is done by C.S. Lewis. She comes out of this idea that our contemporary interest in reflective theological tradition stands in an ancient tradition. Like this has been done all throughout the generations, not just in like academic work or fulsome theological work, but in the pulpit, in the prayer room, in the Psalms reflections, in scriptures, in pilgrims' narratives, and in early fiction and poetry. It's just all over the place. And so this ancient tradition is one that she's trying to, even though she's moving pretty far forward as a feminist theologian, as a post-structuralist thinker, she still is rooting herself to this tradition. A couple things to note about autoethnography is that Walton comes out of the idea that good writing's always contextually located and painstakingly reconstructed. So I think that's an important reflection, at least when it comes to the good writing that we're talking about with the self. She wants to move kind of let the words reflection and reflexivity move back and forth. Reflexivity turns the lens of discovering upon the self. So it's interrogation of the self, writing about the self, meaning making, all these things are located in the self. And so that's an important distinction. So I become part of the data set of the literature I'm studying or the theology that I'm trying to talk about. Walton assumes there's no possibility of a truly uncontaminated point of view. She goes further than C.S. Lewis would do, but of course C.S. Lewis argued that no model of thought is a catalogue of ultimate realities and discarded image. So he wants to offer a caution about both objectivist thinking, about we can know all there is to know, and then total subjectivist thinking that we can't know anything. Now, there are some dangers that are important to think about, which I'll leave for you to think about, and I would encourage you to look at her chapters if you're interested in self-writing and autoethnography. Walton ends up breaking autoethnography down into sort of three main categories, and I want to draw some of C.S. Lewis's ways that he does this instinctively in his own work. And autoethnography is that personal experience, the lens upon the self, and of course we already saw that in that Cambridge inaugural address. That's what he was doing in particular. But he does it all throughout his literary criticism, all the way up to his really kind of his first and last book, Discarded Image, which was a series of lectures pulled into a book published just after he died, where he admits that he's unabashedly part of the medieval world that he's describing. He really wants to see himself there. His sermons are often reflexive, particularly, like the weight of glory and transposition, and really kind of important, drawing his own life either as part of the primary data for discovery or as an illustration of some main point. But we also see it in more popular pieces and literary theory, like in On Stories, where he says that he actually has to be autobiographical. I'm quoting here, be autobiographical for the sake of being evidential. He even kind of apologizes for it, but he suspects this autobiographical interest, quotes, if he's not absolutely alone, that there'll be a chance that it'll help edify others. Okay, so that's key to the way that he approaches. And then finally, in an experiment of criticism where he moves fully at the end of his life to looking at the reader's experience as a way of doing criticism. So these are key aspects, and I know I'm only outlining, but I think you can get a sense of the kind of project that Lewis is doing, and we'll take another approach to this, and you'll see some more examples. Journaling is another approach of self-writing, of autographic writing. It's a way of using experience that allows us to see changes that take place over time. And, Lewis does this. All My Road Before Me is his journal, but when he became a Christian, he kind of felt like he had been, in a sense, saved from having to journal anymore. Yet at the end of his life, after his wife died, or not long after his wife died, he turns to journal writing, A Grief Observed, where he can process his own experience of loss in a way that thinks out loud, that shapes theological questions and response for people in the world. It's really an intriguing and deep and connected book that's worth reading. Lewis also, in his fiction, uses journaling. The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, the manuscripts suggest that it actually began with Eustace's journal. But Till We Have Faces is an anti-confession, a St. Augustinian anti-confession. The whole thing is a journal, a diary, a lawsuit against the gods. And it's with the gods, the gods' surgery is Orwell, the main character's own pen, which I think is a brilliant comment about what journaling can do, both in kind of personal growth for an individual, but also in writing theologically or writing literarily as a theologian. Now, I'm not going to go too far into it, but epistolarity could be an interesting question with journaling, and Lewis uses epistles all through in nonfiction and all kinds of fiction. I mean, Screwtape Letters, obviously, letters to Malcolm, those are the structured ones, but we actually see epistolary in various forms in Lewis's work and in the letter collections where he's offering spiritual direction, like in the Letters to an American Lady and things like that. And then finally, life writing. This is reflecting upon how experience shapes identity. And Lewis has a couple of autobiographies where he does this Pilgrim's Regress, although that is an allegorical piece, and so it's really quite different. Surprised by Joy is an unusual memoir. Some called it Suppressed by Jack because it just seemed to mask as much as it mirrored of C.S. Lewis's life. But Surprised by Joy is a philosophical reflection on the numinous experience using his own story as an example. It's a perfect example of this. And we actually see in C.S. Lewis's life how he's consistently trying to tell his story. This particular document here from an archive shows that Lewis begins one of his autobiographical attempts in an archival piece that he didn't finish. I was born on November 29th, 1898. He actually gets the date wrong at first, and begins to just tell his story. He does this over and over again in the archives, trying to get his story out. Even his preface to the first BBC Talks book, so this is before Mere Christianity, is an example of, telling his own story and drawing himself into what becomes Mere Christianity. I gave these talks not because I am anyone in particular, but because, and then he gives some examples from his own story about why that might be important. Okay. Now, quite briefly, there are 7 major trajectories that Walton describes that goes the direction of theological reflection, this autoethnography and life writing and journaling and things like that, and the way that they're working. And Lewis works in some of these, but not in others. Writing the living human document is the intimate personal companion speaking through interiority. God's speaking in the moment, and A Grief Observed is a perfect example of this thing. The canonical narrative theology is kind of interesting, where you put yourself into the Bible stories and see what's there. And that's not really a big factor of what Lewis does, a little bit in Reflections in the Psalms. But if you actually look at his own fiction, it's often retelling a biblical story. Think of Paralandra, which is the Garden of Eden story in space, or the Narnian stories often have a biblical motif in them. However, constructive narrative theology, where you're looking more broadly at the Christian tradition from various perspectives, and Lewis does this all over the place. In nonfiction, Lewis talks about the baptism of his imagination by George MacDonald. And elsewhere, he talks about his conversion story as a military surrender. So actually drawing his whole story into his conversion story into this one particular image. And then in fiction or quasi-fiction, he has a Dante retelling of purgatory in The Great Divorce, or a progress narrative like John Bunyan in Pilgrim's Regress, but we also see it in other parts of his fairy tale writing. He even uses what I believe is liturgy and That Hideous Strength to shape that entire book, in that case the marriage ceremony. And he retells John Milton's Paradise Lost, which is a Genesis Eden retelling in Paralandra. Now, corporate theological reflection is interesting. At first, I thought that this wasn't something Lewis did. He often worked independently. But we see actually in essays presented to Charles Williams, which he edits, we actually see an almost kind of meeting of the inklings of a number of imaginative writers and friends. And even T.S. Eliot was originally part of that project, and he didn't get his piece in. But that actually brings together much of what the thinking was of the period. His Arthurian torso was bringing his and Charles Williams' thought together. The Socratic Club that Lewis was the chairman of in Oxford for all those years, his initial document, the Manifesto, is probably in this sense a group writing. If you look at Tolkien's Notion Papers story and Diana Gleyer's The Company They Keep, you can see examples in the inklings of this interconnectivity. But this is a little thin as a stream. Critical correlation, this is where theological reflection emerges out of a conversation between the Christian revelation and the human experience and culture. Okay, this is all over Lewis's talks, all over his essays, and you can actually see my blog post about reading C.S. Lewis's essays, where you can just see where you can find these essays. Pick up almost any essay volume, you will see this going on. Walton describes it as the life world being taken up into a higher theological frame. This is all over the place. This is like in 100 of 150 of Lewis's essays. You will find this going on there. Praxis as practice. That's key for Lewis, but is much more limited. His sermons often begin with practice, with Christian practice. So transposition about kind of the experience of, a number of experiences, but the experience of something outside of the self. And then the slip of the tongue begins with the experience of prayer, an accident in prayer in this case. And surprise by joy is a reflection of joy. So there is practice in this, although Lewis usually kind of gives the framework for practice more than the practice itself. Lewis is not terribly connected on the idea of local theology, which is where you would work in a particular context with that group's language and rhythms and being. But if you actually look at his lecture, Christian Apologetics, he's speaking to Welsh priests and pastors and youth leaders, and he really urges them to be translating into their vernacular tongue all of their theological ideas, going so far as to suggest that they don't understand the theology unless they can make that translation. All right. Now, I don't know how far Lewis can go down the road with Heather Walton. Did he ask the kinds of questions that feminist theologians and self-reflective writers are asking today, particularly about presuppositions, gender, class, identity, sexuality, those sorts of things? I do want to suggest that there is some of this in Lewis. He doesn't always have a sense, say, of the limitations, but he certainly keeps suggesting that he's got a pretty narrow point of view and that people should be thinking about things themselves. But even more than that, actually, what's really intriguing is Lewis had a prophetic view of the role of literature in thought. He says at the end of an experiment of criticism, we want to see with other eyes, to imagine with other imaginations, to feel with other hearts as well as with our own. And then he gives the example of love, of justice, of charity, and then literature, this impulse to get out of the self in order to experience other things. He roots this in the gospel idea of he that loses his life shall save it, this particular idea, but then throws it out back into the world of literature. He actually thinks that we should be reading prophetically old books of people that we don't agree with, so that they can work upon us. We want to enter into other people's beliefs, Lewis says, even though we think they're untrue, enter into their passions, their imaginations, even though they're problematic. Okay, we don't want to chiefly do this so they can occupy for a while that seat, just for the sake of the seat, but so that you can, when entering into literature, you can see, to use the spectacles. Remember Heather Walton and the lens of seeing? You can use the spectacle and be made free of whatever insights, joy, terrors, wonder, and merriment the spectacles reveal, the particular poet or author reveal. My own eyes, Lewis says, are not enough for me. I will see through those of others. But in reading great literature, I become 1,000 men and yet remain myself. Like the night sky in the Greek poem, I see with myriad eyes, yet it is still I who see. Here, as in worship and love and moral action and in knowing, I transcend myself, and I am never more myself when I do. This is the profound idea of the prophetic example of reading, in pretty nice poetic terms. Now, what's really intriguing about Lewis is that we actually see this huge kind of counter movement within his whole work. His very first book of theory comes out of a series of essays and controversies in the 1930s with a Dr. Tilliard, who had produced the Milton book that looks kind of intimately and tries to read Milton through the poem and get at the personality of Milton from the poem. And Lewis wants to push back on this. He says, I want to maintain that when we read poetry as poetry, we should not there should be no representative which claims to be the poet, no man, no character, no personality, right? To see things as the poet sees them, I must share his consciousness and not attend to it. I must look where he looks and not around to face him. I must make of him not a spectacle, something to look at, but a pair of spectacles, something to see through. You can see the distinction. This is, according to Walter Hooper, the lifelong work of C.S. Lewis is resisting the author's private life in the understanding of a text. However, even within this particular pushback, because this seems pretty peculiar, right? Lewis, who reveals his life all over the place, implicates his life in everything he does, is actually resisting us making connections that are too intimate in that relationship. Well, Lewis does soften his thesis throughout the book, throughout the debate, so that he narrows it down to the realm of imaginative literature and poetry, for example. So that's one thing. The other is the voice of the poet may or may not be speaking the poet's self, right? So the narrator is different than the poet. But almost everyone I know, not just in Lewis studies, but outside, uses the personal heresy, commits it, because they like thinking about the author and the text. They like thinking about the implicated nature of the poet. They actually like the biography, the facts of personality, the data for the mental pattern of the man's life, to use Tilliard's terms, which helps us understand the mental pattern as revealed in the art. Like that, don't we do this? I mean, I read C.S. Lewis's poetry to understand Lewis. Same with the other people that I study, J.R.R. Tolkien and L.M. Montgomery, and this whole group of anti-modernist modern writers. Like I love reading their poetry and their fiction and seeing their world and worldview and their attitudes and the things they've discovered within them. And Lewis does this himself in that great book, which is his magnum opus. On almost every page, he reflects somehow on the author's life, aim, intention, context, all those sorts of things. And in fact, he begins the Personal Heresy. The very first words of the Personal Heresy are, "During the war I saw." Like the first words are drawing the lens onto himself. Okay. And moreover, like by the end of the experiment of criticism, we actually see Lewis moving fully to the question of the reader's response, and in the discarded image, fully about preparing the reader through culture. So how do we bring this all together? Well, I don't think we have to resolve all the tensions. Lewis is a non-professional philosopher and informed but not fully immersed literary theoretician, and so I don't think all the tensions have to be answered. But here's a way of bringing this together as a closure. C.S. Lewis, I think, has two ways of seeing, which he talks about. Throughout the personal essay, Lewis begins to distinguish not just genre and voice, which we talked about, but a two-stage reading. One is first surrender to the text, and then receive it, let it work upon us. And then once it's worked upon us, then we consider the poem, the story, we criticize it, we do something with it, we use it, like we teach about it or write about it or reflect on it or criticize it or cast it away because it's not good. But until we've read it, we can't know if it's anything at all. And this is really what he's doing in Experiment in Criticism, and teaching us to surrender to the text, that there's a something there that we're responding to. His literary books are then, in that context, when we see the kind of two ways of reading, we can see how his literary books are really about giving students and readers tools to read well. Culture, religious context, historical setting, language, and the meaning of words. That's all part of receiving the text so that we have what we need to get into it and to do it well. So Lewis writes this essay meditation in a tool shed and in a number of collections. And he imagines a shaft of light. And I have this picture on the screen of the shaft of light coming into the tool shed. And you can see the beam of light. But if you were to look along the beam of light out, you would actually see out through the door and out beyond the door into the wide world beyond, through the forest and right up to the sun. Okay. Now, the limitation of this picture is really interesting because with one picture, I can't show you both looking at the light and looking along the light. It doesn't work that way. And that works for the way that Lewis is trying to understand how we read. At first, we appreciate the reading, and then we receive the reading, and then we do something with the reading. We attend to it in some way. And so he wants to make that distinction in those things. We see this in Lewis's fiction, where Lucy in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, they're caught in a world of darkness. Then a shaft of light comes down from the sky, and everybody's looking at the beam of light. But perceptive Lucy, who's the hero of the tale, looks up the beam of light, and she sees a cruciform albatross, who then leads them out of the darkness. Right? See the two ways of seeing there? Lewis wants to engender both ways of seeing, but in doing so, he wants to remind us of what poor Uncle Andrew finds out the hard way in A Magician's Nephew, is that it depends, for what you see and hear depends a good deal on where you're standing. This situational epistemology is super key for Lewis. You have to place yourself in a situation where you can see well, hear well, receive, in order to be able to understand and eventually respond. And so now we can see how we get back to the Cambridge Address. Lewis is a specimen and a scholar, but he wants to shift the lens, at least temporarily, from him as a scholar telling them about something to him as a specimen living out a poetic worldview. And that shift is really key. Now, what do we do with this? I think Lewis's distinction in literary theory were usually about kind of two things: avoiding objectivistic and subjectivistic reductionisms, like your experience is just this or just that, or, and it can work on both sides. Oh, that's just your particular subjective feeling on this thing. It's not. There's nothing really outside that's related to. Or, oh no, your particular reading happens just because you were brought up this way, or something like that. So these two different reductionisms, and he also resisted like cultural hegemonies. That was a real part of what he was doing. And so this is, but we shouldn't be, I don't think we should view this as just sort of reactionary. He is reactionary, but there's a little revolutionary tendency in his work. The whole present dynasty has got to die and rot before anything can be done at all, he says, near the end of his life. And that's part of what he's doing. He's this rooted revolutionary, always trying to tear up the roots and then to irrigate them to create something new. That's what he wants to do as a scholar. And so we're left with some kind of key questions. What would it mean to receive literature or culture before we use that? I think that's an interesting question. Does what you see and hear depend a good deal on where you stand? If so, what's that mean for our work? What does it mean to recognize different kinds of knowledge today? It's an intriguing question. In an incomplete and instinctive form, Lewis consistently offers an unusual and intriguing perspective about contemporary questions of literary theory, cultural criticism, teaching. And I think it's really worth engaging with him long term on this, but it takes a bit of work because we have to frame them into shape for our particular questions. And when we do so, we're going to see that he's going to offer resistance and resources to various parts of the different movements of our cultural moment. And then finally, I hope that we can open ourselves creatively with excellence, care, perspicuity to self-writing and autoethnography in our teaching, in our writing, and in our scholarship. That's my hope. So this is the particular argument I want to make for reading Lewis in a new way. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me at Brenton Dana, and I would love if you shared this particular piece.